In the winter of 1934, a county clerk in Harlan County, Kentucky, stumbled upon a marriage certificate that should never have existed. The document, yellowed and barely legible, listed the bride as Nellie Mae Goins, age 13. The groom was listed as Samuel Goins, age 41. In the space reserved for relationship to bride, someone had written in cramped script, "Maternal uncle." The certificate bore the signature of a local preacher and 2 witnesses, both using the surname Goins. What made the discovery so disturbing wasn't just the age difference or the blood relation. It was that beneath the certificate, bound with twine, were 6 more, all featuring girls between 12 and 15, all married to uncles, cousins, or stepfathers, all from the same isolated hollow in the Cumberland Mountains. And when investigators finally traveled to that forgotten valley in 1936, they found something that made those certificates look like paperwork for a nightmare that was still very much alive. Before we continue, subscribe and comment with your state. It helps uncover more of these buried Appalachian secrets. The Goins family had occupied the narrow strip of land known as Crowder's Hollow since the 1840s. When the first settlers pushed into the unforgiving terrain of southeastern Kentucky, land records from 1847 show that Ezekiel Goins purchased 240 acres of mountain forest for less than the cost of a mule. The land was considered worthless, too steep for farming, too remote for timber operations, too isolated for any sensible homesteader. But Ezekiel wasn't looking for prosperity. He was looking for privacy. By 1860, the census enumerator noted something strange about the Goins homestead. There were 11 people living on the property, but only 4 distinct surnames appeared in the record. Worse still, the ages didn't make sense. Ezekiel Goins, listed as 46, was recorded as the father of a 19-year-old woman named Sarah Goins, who was also listed as his wife. Their children, ranging from infant to 14 years old, were listed with birth years that suggested Sarah had been bearing children since she was 11. The enumerator made a small note in the margin. Family relations unclear. Recommend follow-up. No follow-up ever came. For the next 70 years, Crowder's Hollow remained a black spot on county maps. Mail carriers refused to deliver there. Missionaries who ventured in came back silent or didn't come back at all. One Methodist circuit rider, in an 1889 letter to his bishop, described the valley as a place forsaken by God's light, where the people speak in whispers and the children watch you like animals deciding whether to flee or attack. But it was the marriage certificates that would finally tear open the truth. Reverend Amos. Spurlock was not a man of God in any traditional sense. He was a self-ordained preacher who operated out of a one-room cabin on the edge of Crowder's Hollow, performing marriages, baptisms, and burials for families who wanted no interaction with county authorities. He kept no church. He collected no tithes. But he did keep a ledger. When Spurlock died in 1933, his cabin was searched by a distant nephew hoping to find a will. Instead, he found a leather-bound book hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside were records of 43 marriages performed between 1911 and 1932. 38 of them involved girls under the age of 15. 12 of them involved uncles marrying nieces. 7 involved first cousins. 3 involved stepfathers marrying stepdaughters within months of their mothers' deaths. But it was entry number 17 that would haunt investigators for decades. Nellie Mae Goins, age 13 years, 4 months, married to Samuel Goins, her mother's brother, on the 12th of June, 1923. Ceremony performed in the presence of Eli Goins and Ruth Goins, bride in good health, groom sober, union blessed. Beneath the entry, in smaller script, was a single line. First child born March 1924, girl, lived 2 days. The nephew who found the ledger brought it to the county clerk, who in turn contacted the state attorney general's office. By the time authorities decided to act, 2 years had passed. But the question remained, was Nellie Mae Goins still alive? And if so, what had her life become? In April of 1936, a state welfare inspector named Howard Beckett was dispatched to Crowder's Hollow with a deputy sheriff and a county health officer. Their mission was to locate Nellie Mae Goins and assess her condition. What they found was a valley locked in a time that should not have existed in 20th century America. The road into Crowder's Hollow was little more than a muddy trail, impassable by automobile, Beckett and his companions walked the final 3 miles on foot. The first home they encountered was a sagging 2-room shack with a roof made of rusted tin and rotting wood. A woman in her 20s stood in the doorway, hollow-eyed and silent. When Beckett asked if she knew the Goins family, she pointed deeper into the hollow and closed the door. They passed 4 more homes before reaching the main Goins property, a sprawling compound of interconnected cabins surrounding a central structure that looked more like a barn than a house. Smoke rose from 3 separate chimneys. Chickens wandered freely, and standing in the yard were 11 children, ages ranging from toddler to mid-teens. Not one of them spoke. Not one of them smiled. An older man emerged from the largest cabin. He introduced himself as Nellie Goins, head of the family. When Beckett asked to speak with Nellie Mae Goins, Eli's expression didn't change. He turned and called into the cabin. A moment later, a woman appeared. She was 26 years old, though she looked closer to 40. Her hair was gray at the temples. Her hands were gnarled and scarred. Her face carried the blank expression of someone who had stopped hoping for anything years ago. She was holding an infant. Beckett asked her name. She said Nellie. He asked if she was married to Samuel Goins. She nodded. He asked how old she had been when she married. She looked at Eli, then back at Beckett. Old enough, she said. Beckett asked to see Samuel. Eli told him Samuel was dead, killed in a logging accident in 1931. Beckett wrote this down, but something didn't sit right. He asked Nellie how many children she'd had. She didn't answer. Eli did. 8, he said. 3 living. The inspector's notes were damning, but they weren't the only record. Because in the county health officer's files, another detail surfaced. Dr. Raymond Cobb had been serving the mountain communities around Harlan County for nearly 2 decades when he was asked to provide medical testimony regarding the Goins family. His records, compiled between 1928 and 1935, painted a picture of genetic collapse so severe that it bordered on biological impossibility. In 1928, Cobb was called to Crowder's Hollow to deliver a child for a girl named Ruth Goins, age 14. The father was listed as her cousin, though Cobb suspected it was actually her uncle. The child was born with severe cranial deformities and lived less than an hour. Cobb recorded the cause of death as congenital malformation incompatible with life. He was called back to the Hollow 6 more times over the next 7 years. Each time the mother was a girl between 13 and 16. Each time the father was a close male relative. And each time, the child either died within days or exhibited deformities that Cobb described as inconsistent with natural human development. One child was born with fused fingers and no discernible eye sockets. Another had a spine so twisted it formed a near-perfect loop. A third was delivered stillborn with what Cobb described as skin translucent enough to see the malformed organs beneath. But the case that broke him was Nellie Mae Goins. In 1929, Cobb was summoned to deliver her 4th child. She was 19 years old and had already lost 3 infants. When he arrived, she was in labor in a room lit only by kerosene lamps. The delivery was long and brutal. When the child finally emerged, Cobb realized immediately that something was catastrophically wrong. The infant had 2 distinct faces. One was positioned normally. The other was partially formed on the side of the skull, with a single functioning eye and a mouth that moved independently. The child lived for 6 hours. Cobb sat with Nellie the entire time, watching the infant struggle to breathe through malformed lungs. When it finally died, Nellie didn't cry. She simply asked when her husband would let her rest. Cobb included this case in his testimony to state authorities, but his report was filed away and forgotten. The reason was simple. Nobody wanted to admit that an entire family had been breeding itself into oblivion in the mountains of Kentucky, and the state had done nothing to stop it. But what investigators found next was far worse than they imagined. When a follow-up team returned to Crowder's Hollow in late 1936, they brought a genealogist and a child welfare advocate. Their goal was to map the family tree and determine how many children were living in conditions of abuse or neglect. What they discovered was a family structure so tangled that it defied documentation. There were 19 children living in the Goins compound. Only 6 of them could provide their own names. The others responded only to nicknames or descriptions. The small one, the boy with the limp, the girl who doesn't speak. When investigators asked who their parents were, the answers were contradictory. One 12-year-old girl claimed her father was Nellie Goins. Another child, roughly the same age, claimed Eli was her grandfather. A third said he was her uncle. DNA testing didn't exist in 1936, but the genealogist attempted to reconstruct the family tree using birth records, marriage certificates, and interviews. What emerged was a chart that looped back on itself so many times it resembled a knot more than a tree. Nellie Goins. The family patriarch had fathered children with at least 4 different women, 2 of whom were his nieces, 1 his cousin and 1 his stepdaughter. Several of those children had gone on to marry each other, producing a second generation so inbred that genetic defects were nearly universal. Cleft palates, club feet, cognitive disabilities, and blindness appeared in over 60% of the children. But the most disturbing discovery came from the cellar beneath the main cabin. It was the smell that led them there. A sweet rotting odor that permeated the main cabin despite the cold April air. When investigators asked Eli what was causing it, he claimed it was a dead animal under the floorboards. But the health officer wasn't convinced. He pried up several boards in the corner of the cabin and found a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The cellar was roughly 8 feet by 10 feet, with a dirt floor and walls lined with stones. There were no windows, no ventilation, and along the back wall, partially hidden beneath a canvas tarp, were 7 small wooden boxes. They were coffins, child-sized, unmarked. When the health officer opened the first one, he found the remains of an infant, wrapped in stained cloth. The second box contained another. The third held 2. By the time they finished, they had counted 11 bodies. None of them had been buried. None of them had death certificates. And based on the state of decomposition, some had been in that cellar for years. Nellie Goins was arrested on the spot. But when investigators tried to determine which children the bodies belonged to, they hit a wall. No one in the family would talk. Nellie Mae refused to speak. The other women claimed they didn't know. And the children simply stared in silence. The coroner estimated that the infants had died between 1930 and 1936. Cause of death could not be determined for most of them, though several showed signs of severe birth defects. One had a skull so malformed it resembled a deflated balloon. Another had limbs fused together at the joints. When Eli was asked why he hadn't reported the deaths, he said, "They wasn't meant to live." The statement would haunt the court proceedings for months. Nellie Goins was charged with multiple counts of child endangerment, unlawful burial, and incest. The trial was set for September 1936, but before it could begin, something strange happened. Witnesses began recanting their statements. The deputy sheriff who had accompanied Beckett to the hollow claimed he didn't remember seeing anything unusual. Dr. Cobb's medical records were mysteriously lost in a courthouse fire. And the genealogist who had mapped the family tree left Kentucky and refused to return. Beckett, the welfare inspector, was the only one who stood firm. He testified that the conditions in Crowder's Hollow were among the worst he had ever seen. He described the cellar, the bodies, the children who couldn't name their parents. He brought photographs, blurry, haunting images of the compound, the cabin, the hollow-eyed children standing in the yard. But the prosecution's case fell apart when Nellie Mae Goins took the stand. She testified that her marriage to Samuel had been consensual. She claimed she had been happy. She said the children in the cellar had died of natural causes, and that Eli had simply been too poor to afford proper burials. And when the prosecutor asked if she had been forced into marriage at age 13, she looked directly at the jury and said, "I chose my life." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Nellie Goins was acquitted on all charges. Beckett's final report to the State Attorney General was 8 pages long. In it, he wrote, "We did not fail because the evidence was insufficient. We failed because no one wanted to believe that a family could do this to itself and survive. But I have seen it, and I know it is still happening." The report was filed away. Crowder's Hollow was left alone. In 1942, a fire swept through Crowder's Hollow, destroying most of the Goins compound. 3 people died in the blaze, including Nellie Goins. The surviving family members scattered throughout the region, changing their names and disappearing into other mountain communities. Nellie Mae Goins was never seen again, but the story didn't end there. In 1958, a social worker in neighboring Bell County encountered a family living in conditions eerily similar to those described in Beckett's 1936 report. The patriarch's name was different, but the structure was the same. Isolated homestead, intermarried cousins, children with no birth certificates, and a cellar that no one was allowed to enter. The social worker filed a report. It was never investigated. In 1973, a journalist researching Appalachian poverty interviewed an elderly woman in Harlan County who claimed her grandmother had been married to her kin as a child. When pressed for details, the woman described a compound in a hollow where children were born in secret and buried in silence. She wouldn't give the family name. She said it would bring trouble. And in 1989, a hiker exploring the abandoned remains of Crowder's Hollow found a stone marker hidden beneath decades of overgrowth. It bore a single engraved name, Nellie Mae 1910, no death date, no epitaph, just a question mark where the end of her life should have been. The marriage certificate that started it all still exists, locked in a vault in the Harlan County Courthouse. Researchers have requested access to it multiple times, but each request has been quietly denied. The official reason is privacy concerns. The unofficial reason is that no one wants to admit what was allowed to happen in those mountains. Not for 1 year, but for generations. Crowder's Hollow is empty now. The cabins have collapsed. The cellar is filled with mud and stones, but people who live in the surrounding valleys say that on certain nights when the wind moves through the trees just right, you can hear something that sounds like children singing. Not playing, singing. The same song over and over in voices that never seem to grow older. Some say it's just the wind. Others say it's the valley itself, keeping time with a rhythm that was carved into it long ago. But the ones who grew up near Crowder's Hollow, they don't go near that land after dark, because they know what the archives tried to bury. They know what the courts refused to see. And they know that some bloodlines don't end. They just sink deeper into the soil, waiting for the world to forget they ever existed. Nellie Mae Goins was 13 years old when her uncle became her husband. And somewhere in the Kentucky mountains, her name is still whispered in the dark.